January 30, 1933. German President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as chancellor. The country was seething with political unrest and financial woes. The mood in Germany called for swift action to address the instability and social chaos. Angry mobs roamed the streets. Hitler and his Nazi party were seen as the answer. Much of the country was swept up in the mania. A year later, journalist William Schreier described his impressions of Berlin, where old acquaintances, the liberals, the socialists, and even the communist friends of his were, quote, full of the Nazi bug, addressing me solemnly about Germany's destiny under the Führer, a nation reborn and once more based on the solid traditions of the old Germany, which respected authority. I could scarcely believe that these were the same Germans I had once met and liked and admired. Freedom to say and write and publish what you pleased, to vote as you wished, to belong to a party or a union or an association of your choice, all of which Hitler had quickly deprived them of, no longer seemed to matter. End quote. So complete was the transformation of society, so quickly it all happened. On February 1, 1933, only 2 days after Hitler's appointment as chancellor, a 26-year-old seminary student named Dietrich Bonhoeffer gave a radio address entitled "The Younger Generation's Altered View of the Concept of Führer." His message was at odds with what was developing in Germany. It was the first criticism of the new chancellor before a national audience. He explained that, quote, there is currently a terrible danger that in the crying out for authority, for a leader or office, we forget that the human being is an individual before the ultimate authority, and that everyone who misappropriates this breaks an eternal law and takes on superhuman responsibility, which in the end will crush him. Leader and office that turn themselves into gods mock God and the individual before him and must collapse. Only the leader who is in the service of the penultimate and ultimate authority merits loyalty. End quote. Before he finished his radio talk, the broadcast was cut off. Now, there is some speculation over how and why his speech was interrupted. As biographer Eric Metaxas points out, it's unlikely that Hitler's henchmen ordered the microphones turned off, since the broadcast had been planned for a while and was not a response to Hitler's election. In fact, the speech was not about Hitler directly, but about the Führer principle. What we do know, however, is that Bonhoeffer was silenced for taking a position that was at odds with his contemporaries. Given the point at which Bonhoeffer was cut off, the audience would likely have assumed that he was caught up in the spirit of the time and was supporting Hitler. But in fact, his point was to warn against embracing the Führer as an idol. Bonhoeffer was attempting to remind his fellow Germans that earthly leaders were subject to a higher power, God. Bonhoeffer saw through Hitler's claim to follow God. Bonhoeffer and his family were not at all convinced by the propaganda of the cynical politician who used God as a rhetorical prop to convince the masses that his intentions were benign. Bonhoeffer's opposition to the Nazi regime began with reflection, thinking through his convictions, followed by speaking and writing his views in a logical, rational way. Before long, this led to action, as he served in the resistance movement until he was arrested in 1943 after conspiring to help Jewish people escape Germany. Eventually, Bonhoeffer would pay the ultimate price for standing up to the Führer, who made himself an idol. Along with the power of individual conscience, Bonhoeffer's story highlights the importance of free speech, being able to freely share your ideas, even ideas that challenge the government or the experts of the day, is the hallmark of a free, peaceful, and open society. By contrast, a totalitarian regime seeks to control ideas and limit dissent. Speaking out can be costly. Indeed, whenever a prevailing spirit takes over society, it is very difficult for a contrarian to speak up with a thought that goes against the accepted view. It takes a lot of courage to speak to an unfriendly audience. In his book, Nothing Left to Lose, an impolite report on the state of freedom in Canada, author Philip Slayton makes the following dedication. Quote, "One day in 1963, when I was a student at the University of Manitoba, I attended a campus conference on a political subject. Someone in the audience tried to shout down a speaker who was expressing unpopular views. Another member of the audience, a student, leaped to his feet and gave an extemporaneous, eloquent, and impassioned defense of freedom of speech. I remember it as if it were yesterday. When the intervener sat down, the audience clapped with enthusiasm, and the heckler went silent, and the speaker with unpopular views carried on. The student intervener was Roger Beeler, who became my lifelong friend. In later years, Roger was a distinguished philosopher, finishing his career as chairman of the philosophy department at the University of Victoria. He died in 2006. I miss Roger and his passion for freedom. This book is dedicated to him." End quote. This anecdote would be powerful in any context, but it is even more striking when we compare it to our present age of deplatforming. Today, we're more likely to hear of students protesting against an unpopular speaker than supporting one. Recently, I had the privilege of interviewing Philip Slayton about his book, and I encourage you to get a copy. He is a first-rate thinker, and his voice is important for all Canadians to hear about the lack of freedom we are experiencing in this country. In the coming days, we will be releasing the conversation I had with Mr. Slayton, and you will not want to miss it. A few days ago, Jordan Peterson put up a video clip of himself being interviewed at Stanford University. He was asked about freedom of speech, and his answer offers a marvelous articulation of why this freedom is so very important. Indeed, it is a first freedom. Peterson begins by exploring the internal process of thinking through a problem, mentally asking and answering questions in order to test a proposition and come to a resolution. He points out that this process can be very difficult, which is why individuals typically develop their ideas and their sense of self by talking to others. Peterson argues that you have a right to free speech because the entirety of society depends on this for its ability to adapt to the changing horizon of the future. So societies that are going to function over any reasonable amount of time must leave their citizens alone to grapple stupidly with complexity, so that out of that stupid grappling, fraught grappling, that's offensive and difficult and upsetting, we can grope towards the truth collectively, end quote. Peterson also turns to a divine rationale for free speech, pointing out that in the Judeo-Christian tradition, the Creator God transforms the chaos of potential into habitable reality. That is good. And he uses the word, the divine word, logos, to do that. And what that implies is that the word that's truthful. According to Peterson, this concept is vital to our relationships, regardless of our religious or non-religious views. We all want to be treated as worthy of being heard. And Peterson insists, if you try to structure your social relationships on any other basis than that intrinsic respect for their intrinsic value, it's going to fail. You know, I'm reminded of the statement of Justice Robert H. Jackson in West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, which involved the issue of Jehovah's Witnesses saluting to the flag. In that decision, Justice Jackson wrote this, quote, "If there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in matters of politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word their faith therein," end quote. You know, it's no accident that here at First Freedoms Foundation, the first freedom that we talk about is freedom of speech. It is freedom of speech that allows you and me to be able to share what is on our hearts, what is in our minds, what we are trying to articulate in facing the problems that we see evident in our lives and in our society at large. It's extremely important to recognize that we need each other in this journey. We need to be able to speak because, as Peterson emphasizes, when we speak, we are in fact thinking. And through dialogue, we develop and strengthen our own beliefs. Sometimes we encounter disagreement. We discover our own flaws or mistaken assumptions. Our identity is shaped and our behavior is guided by the conversations we have. And this is how we learn and grow as human beings and as a society. Philosophically, that's why we need to protect all speech, not just speech that we agree with. Even if we feel offended by someone's comments, we must allow them to speak so that they can move closer to the truth of the matter. Shutting off the microphone is hardly an effective way to change someone's mind. Now, folks, of course, I'm not talking about spewing hatred. As Justice Holmes of the U.S. Supreme Court famously warned, you don't yell fire in a crowded theater. So please understand that context is important. But my point is simply this, that we have to make space for discussions and debate if we want to move forward. Whatever problems we may face at any given time, we need to be free to speak. But unfortunately, we see many examples in today's world where people are being shut out. We see the examples on social media where individuals who try to express a view that goes outside the accepted narrative can have their accounts suspended, their tweets removed, or their videos deleted. The trouble is that this kind of censorship doesn't just protect people from the supposed harm, it prevents individuals from finding innovative solutions to difficult issues that require creative, unfettered thinking. That's one reason why we here at First Freedoms value the chance to host discussions with people who are willing to be contrarian, who are willing to speak out against a narrative on whatever subject we're dealing with. A prime example is the health crisis we've been facing over the last 2 years. It's no conspiracy to say that governments, media, and big corporations have actively shut down certain speech. Even if you agree with the public health authorities, you should be worried whenever politicians interfere with free speech. You might be in alignment with the government today, but what happens when the narrative shifts and you no longer share the same position as the powers that be? We hear a lot about misinformation and disinformation, and that is certainly a cause for concern. But the best way to combat disinformation is not censorship, it's freedom. Let the dispute be exposed. Let the sunlight of truth that shines upon the so-called disinformation, and truth will be revealed. Why are we so afraid of that? It makes no sense to label anyone who holds a different view than us. But unfortunately, We see this in the House of Commons when one member stands up and makes a comment or a question, and then another member stands up to accuse their opponent of spreading disinformation. But this is completely counterproductive. The whole point of Parliament, notice the root word there, parler, to speak, the house of speaking, is to be able to speak. You don't just shut people down because you disagree. If they are truly misinformed, you engage in debate to prove your point with evidence, not with ad hominem attacks. Given all that we have seen over the past few years, we have to ask ourselves if we want our current government to have the power of censoring the internet, which they're proposing to do right now with Bill C-11. Now, this legislation is currently at second reading before the House of Commons. Do we really want to take the dysfunction that we are currently experiencing and institutionalize that dysfunction in a piece of legislation that is going to prevent us from speaking to one another? I mean, allowing the government to shut down the various websites that it finds offensive will not lead to a freer or better society. It didn't lead to a free Germany. It didn't lead to a free Russia. It hasn't led to a free China or a North Korea. So why do we think that it's going to be any different here? It's important not to let ourselves to be forced into groupthink. We've got to be able to think for ourselves. One of the greatest strengths of our liberal democratic countries is that we have freedom of thought, freedom of belief, freedom of speech. Our speaking is, in essence, our thinking. We may not agree with the way some people think. You may not agree with the way I'm thinking right now. But I'm speaking out loud. I'm speaking to you, and I'm saying, let us at least agree that we need to have the freedom to think. And if you agree with the freedom to think, then you must agree to the freedom of speech, because it is through speech that we're able to think and reason together, to be able to come to a resolution on how we can live together on this real estate that we call Canada. And folks, let me tell you, that's why we exist. That's why we at First Freedoms are here, to encourage people to think about their first freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, and the inviolability of the person. And if you have any questions to share, please do so. I'm happy to have a chat, to continue the conversation. And until next time, I'm Barry Bussey. The fight for freedom consists not only in the legal battles in court, but also in the battle of ideas at the universities and in the media. It takes time, effort, and money to keep on top of the debates for freedom. Your donation allows us to keep fighting for all Canadians. FirstFreedoms.ca